Naomi Pierce had cleaned many homes in her life. From narrow apartments pressed between brick buildings on Atlanta's south side to quiet suburban houses where the air always smelled faintly of lemon polish and restraint. But nothing, not the size, not the wealth, not even the isolation, had prepared her for the Holt estate resting along the far curve of a private lake outside Atlanta, hidden behind iron gates and towering pines that swallowed sound as if it was something fragile. The house rose out of the trees like a structure, built from stillness itself. Stone walls stretched wide and deliberate, their pale surfaces cold even in daylight. Tall windows stared outward beneath heavy drapes drawn tight, as though the world beyond them had been intentionally shut out. When Naomi stepped out of the service car that morning, the winter air bit sharply at her cheeks, carrying with it a strange hush that made her breath sound too loud in her ears. A representative from the private staffing agency walked beside her, heels clicking softly on the stone path before slowing, her voice lowering instinctively, as if the house could hear them. "Before we go inside," the woman said, glancing toward the doors, "there are rules." Naomi nodded, her gloved hands clasped calmly in front of her. "Do not speak to Mr. Holt unless he speaks to you first." The woman continued, "Do not touch the piano in the West Room. Do not open the curtains. And absolutely no singing in the house." Naomi blinked at the last rule, surprised, despite herself. "No singing," she repeated gently. The woman avoided her eyes. "It unsettles him. That is all you need to know." The front doors opened without ceremony, and the silence inside pressed in immediately. The hallway stretched long and dim, framed by polished wood and stone, lined with photographs whose faces were hidden by shadow and years of dustless neglect. Naomi could sense the air itself was heavy, though every surface gleamed as if it were cleaned daily. The agency had warned her that this job was not for everyone. The pay was generous. The emotional weight was not. "Your employer is Zion Holt," the representative said as they walked. "Founder of Resonant Labs. Billionaire at 32. Recluse by paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident 2 years ago." She hesitated, then added quietly, "His wife died in that same accident." Naomi absorbed the words in silence, feeling the grief that lingered in the walls like an echo that never fully faded. She had worked with lonely people before, people who no longer believed in mornings, who lived carefully inside themselves, but this felt different. This house did not just contain sorrow, it preserved it. A soft mechanical whir rolled down the corridor ahead of them. The representative stiffened. "That's him," she whispered. "Do not make eye contact. Do not address him." Naomi turned instinctively, then lowered her gaze as a shadow passed at the far end of the hall. Zion Holt was thinner than she had imagined. His shoulders looked sharp beneath a charcoal sweater, his hands resting lightly on the sleek rims of his wheelchair. His face was unreadable, carved into stillness. Yet something about his presence radiated a cold resolve that made Naomi's chest tighten. He did not look at her, nor at the representative, nor at anything around him. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, dark, distant, like embers long extinguished. He rolled past without a word. The soft sound of the wheels, the only evidence he had been there at all, disappearing into the west wing as though swallowed by the house itself. Naomi released a slow breath. She had not realized she was holding Dot. The representative exhaled shakily. "You will not see him often. He prefers isolation." They continued into the service kitchen, where a neatly printed list of duties waited on thick paper. Naomi read it carefully. Daily cleaning, maintaining functionality, preserving order without disruption. No conversation, no music, no unexpected movement. This was not a home built for living. It was a structure designed to protect a man who no longer wished to exist in the world. As Naomi explored the rooms one by one, she felt it more clearly. In the study, dust traced faint outlines where papers had once rested untouched for months. In the living room, a cello case sat quietly in the corner, closed, but not forgotten. In the West Room, the piano stood beneath a heavy cloth, its presence unmistakable like a sleeping animal no one dared disturb. Naomi knew the shape of grief. But this was something else entirely. This was a house burying its owner alive. The first day passed in silence. Naomi moved with careful precision, wiping counters, checking windows, preparing the kitchen for the evening. She rarely heard Zion, only the faint roll of his wheelchair behind closed doors or the delicate sound of glass being set down with deliberate care. As dusk settled, the representative prepared to leave. She paused at the door, her expression tight. "Nights are the hardest," she warned. "Do not interfere with him. Do not knock on his door, no matter what you hear." Naomi frowned. "What do you mean by that?" "You'll understand soon." When the door closed behind her, the house settled around Naomi like a heavy coat. She prepared tea and placed it outside Zion's study as instructed, then retreated to the staff quarters, where she was told to remain unless needed. Hours passed. The wind whispered through the trees. The lake creaked under winter tension. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she wondered if it came from the house or from something inside herself. A broken breath, another dot, a shaky exhale. Caught between pain and denial, Naomi opened her door quietly and stepped into the hallway. From the study at the far end came the rhythmic sound of a wheelchair moving back and forth, pacing without progress. She heard Zion's breathing uneven, fractured. The sound of someone wrestling with a memory sharp enough to draw blood. Something thudded softly, a hand striking an armrest, then silence, then a sound like a strangled gasp. Naomi did not approach. She stood still, understanding instinctively that she was listening to a man reliving the moment the world had taken everything from him. When the house finally grew quiet again, she closed her door. Sleep did not come. The house was too full of things that had never been said. Morning arrived quietly, as though the house itself were cautious about waking. Naomi Pierce rose before the sun, her body already attuned to the hush that wrapped the estate like a second skin. She moved through her routine with careful steadiness, washing her face, smoothing her uniform, grounding herself before stepping back into the long corridors that seemed to remember everything. The tea she had left outside, Zion Holt's study the night before, sat untouched. The porcelain cup cold, its surface dulled by the absence of hands that might have lifted it. Naomi carried it away without comment, but her eyes lingered on the study door longer than necessary. Inside that room lived a silence that felt too deliberate to be empty. As she passed through the hallway, she noticed details she had missed the day before. The blanket draped over the study chair lay crumpled now, twisted as if it had been clenched in shaking fists. Near the entrance to the west room, a small photo frame rested face down on a narrow table. Naomi hesitated, then lifted it gently. The photograph showed a woman with warm, open eyes and a smile that reached all the way into them. Her expression held a quiet confidence, the kind that suggested laughter came easily to her. Naomi did not need to read the name on the back to know who she was looking at. Imani Holt, the woman whose absence filled the house more completely than her presence ever could. Naomi set the frame upright again, her fingers lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Something tightened in her chest, a sorrow she could not claim as her own, yet could not ignore either. In that moment, she understood something essential about her place here. Her work was not just to polish floors or dust shelves. It was to keep this house from collapsing under the weight of its grief. The day unfolded slowly, the silence broken only by the muted sounds of Naomi's movements. She cleaned with intention, moving carefully, respecting the invisible lines that had been drawn long before she arrived. She rarely heard Zion, only the soft glide of his wheelchair behind closed doors or the faint click of something being set down with precision. By evening, the quiet felt heavier than it had the night before. The agency representative returned briefly to check in before leaving for the night. She stood near the door, her posture tense. "Remember what I told you," she said. "Nights are the worst. Whatever you hear, do not interfere. Do not knock. Do not try to help." Naomi frowned slightly. "Why?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because sometimes helping makes it worse." The door closed, and Naomi was alone again. She prepared another cup of tea and placed it outside Zion's study, just as instructed. The hallway light remained dim, barely enough to trace the edges of the floor. Naomi retreated to the staff quarters and waited. Time passed slowly, stretching thin. The wind whispered along the eaves, brushing the house with cold fingers. Somewhere beyond the walls, the lake groaned beneath the pressure of winter. Then it came. A sound so soft, Naomi nearly missed it. A breath broken. Uneven. Another, sharper this time. A fragile exhale caught between pain and resistance. Naomi's body went still. She opened her door quietly and stepped into the hallway, her movements instinctively careful. From the study came the muted rhythm of a wheelchair rolling back and forth, forward and back, as if pacing were possible if repeated enough times. Zion's breathing carried down the corridor, raw and unguarded. The sound of someone trapped inside a moment that refused to loosen its grip. There was a dull thud, something striking wood or metal, followed by a long, suffocating pause. Then a sound escaped him that made Naomi's chest ache. Not a cry, not quite a sob. Something caught halfway between the two. Naomi did not move closer. She stood where she was, understanding without being told that this was not a moment meant for interruption. This was the echo of a man reliving the second his world had ended. The moment when survival itself became a burden too heavy to bear. Eventually, the sounds faded. The wheelchair stopped. The house returned to its practiced stillness. As though nothing had happened at all, Naomi retreated back into her room and closed the door gently behind her. Sleep did not come easily. The walls felt thick with memory, saturated with grief that had nowhere to go. Naomi lay awake, listening to the quiet, her thoughts circling the man down the hall who carried his pain alone, night after night. When morning finally came again, Naomi rose early and resumed her work as if nothing were different. Yet everything felt altered. The untouched tea, the crumpled blanket, the photograph turned face down and then upright again. She moved through the house with renewed care, as though her presence itself mattered now. As she passed the small table near the west room, she glanced once more at Imani's smiling face and felt the weight of an unspoken promise settle in her chest. For now, Naomi offered the only thing she knew how to give: her presence, her steadiness, her quiet refusal to look away. The second morning at the Holt estate unfolded beneath the same dense quiet that had followed Naomi, pierced through the night. But now she understood that the silence was not simply the absence of sound, it was a presence all its own. Something that clung to the walls and settled into the corners of the rooms with the weight of memory. As Naomi moved down the hallway, dusting picture frames and wiping surfaces already spotless, she felt that heaviness sink into her skin, familiar yet newly intimate. Beyond the closed doors, she could sense Zion Holt waking, though waking felt like the wrong word for a man who never truly slept. His nights were battles fought in isolation. His days were ceasefires he endured rather than lived. Naomi passed the west room again, her steps slowing almost unconsciously. The piano's shape beneath its cloth seemed to sag with its own quiet grief, as though it mourned the hands that once brought it to life. She wondered what it had sounded like when it was played by a man who had built an empire on sound itself. Mid-morning brought an interruption. The front doors opened, and the firm cadence of unfamiliar footsteps cut through the stillness. Naomi straightened instinctively as Marcus Reed entered the house. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to bearing responsibility for others. His posture sharp, his expression tight with restrained urgency. He acknowledged Naomi briefly, asking for directions to the study, thanking her with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. When Marcus entered the study, the house seemed to hold its breath. Naomi lingered nearby under the pretense of adjusting a vase, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not mean to listen, but the tension in the air made the words impossible to ignore. "Zion, you can't keep pushing everyone away," Marcus said quietly, his voice strained. "The board is losing patience." There was a long pause before Zion replied, his tone clipped and emotionless. "Then tell them to do what they want. I'm not returning to the office." "You can't run resonant labs from a dark room," Marcus pressed. "You built the company on connection, On innovation, you changed the industry, and now look at me. A soft metallic sound followed as Zion tapped the arm of his wheelchair. Is this what inspires them? Marcus sighed, frustration seeping through his composure. The accident wasn't your fault. But this isolation is. You're refusing treatment, ignoring physical therapy, shutting out every person who still cares. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. When Zion spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of its edge. Imani cared. Look where that led. The words struck Naomi like a cold blade. Though she kept her expression neutral as she continued dusting the same spot for the 5th time, Imani. The name felt sacred, raw, a wound that had never closed. Marcus's tone softened. Zion, you didn't kill her. It was a storm. A terrible storm. And you survived. That wasn't my choice, Zion replied, something in his voice cracking faintly, like ice under pressure. Surviving was the worst thing that could have happened. Marcus fell silent. When he spoke again, exhaustion weighed heavily on every word. If you keep living like this, you'll lose everything you both built. The company, the research, the partnerships. But more than that, you'll lose yourself. There was no response. Moments later, Marcus exited the study, his footsteps sharp with frustration as he crossed the hall. The front doors closed behind him with a decisive finality. Only then did Naomi allow herself to breathe. Later that afternoon, while polishing the banister, Naomi heard a sudden gasp tear through the quiet. Then a choked cry. Her hands stilled. After a brief hesitation, she took a careful step toward the sound, stopping just outside the doorway of Zion's room. The door stood partially open. Inside, she saw him gripping the sides of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His chest heaved, sweat glistening at his temples. His eyes were wide, unfocused, caught somewhere far from the present. A nightmare while awake, a memory attacking without warning. Imani, he whispered, the name breaking apart on his tongue. Please. Naomi's instinct was to reach for him, but she stopped herself. The rules echoed in her mind. Do not touch. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not interfere. But what did rules matter when a human being was splintering in front of you? She did the only thing she could without shattering the fragile boundaries that held his world together. Naomi placed a glass of cold water just inside the room, then stepped back quietly and lowered herself to the floor several feet away. She said nothing. She made no movement that demanded his attention. She simply stayed. Minutes passed before Zion noticed the glass. He reached for it with trembling hands, drank slowly, carefully, then stared at the floor, as if confused by how the world had righted itself again. Eventually, his gaze lifted toward the hallway, landing on Naomi. Not fully, not directly, but enough. Why are you sitting there? He asked, his voice hoarse. Naomi kept her tone soft. You seemed like you might need someone nearby. I didn't ask for help. I know, she said gently. But you weren't alone. His jaw tightened, but he did not tell her to leave. Instead, he turned his wheelchair slightly away from her, angling his body just enough to reclaim distance without shutting her out completely. It was the smallest shift, barely noticeable, but Naomi felt its weight. It was the first time Zion Holt had allowed another person to remain near him while he was vulnerable. In that moment, she understood the truth. No one had spoken aloud. He wasn't refusing help. He was refusing hope, because hope had betrayed him once in the most brutal way possible. When he finally steadied, Naomi rose quietly and returned to her chores, but the fractured look in his eyes followed her, lingering in her thoughts long after the hallway returned to silence. As evening settled in again, Naomi folded linens in the laundry room and imagined the night that had shattered his life. The storm. The crash. The music cut short. A man waking in wreckage, alive when the woman he loved was not. How could anyone survive that without drowning? When night returned, the house resumed its vigil. The wind brushed against the windows like careful fingers. Somewhere in the West Wing, Zion moved slowly through the dim rooms. Naomi heard the rhythm of his wheelchair, Then the pause. She imagined him stopping at the framed photograph in the hall, tracing the memory of a woman he could no longer bear to speak of. Long after midnight, she heard him again, not shouting this time. Just quiet breaths that sounded almost like pleading. Naomi closed her eyes and let the weight of his suffering settle into her chest. She could not take it from him, but she could bear witness. She understood now why she was here, not to restore order to the house, but to ensure the man inside. It did not disappear entirely. Every night at the Holt estate arrived the same way, with the sky slowly darkening over the still lake until the water became a black mirror reflecting nothing but the sharp clarity of the moon. Shadows stretched across the wooden floors, lengthening quietly, and the wind whispered through the tall pines outside as if speaking a language only the house understood. And every night, Naomi Pierce began the rituals no one had asked her to perform, yet ones she somehow knew were necessary. They were small acts, almost invisible, gentle enough to go unnoticed by anyone who did not understand how healing often began in the narrowest corners of a life. Naomi had learned long ago that broken people were rarely mended by grand gestures. They were steadied by consistency, by presence, by someone who refused to vanish when the quiet grew too heavy. The first thing she did each evening was leave a soft amber light glowing in the hallway outside Zion Holt's study. The rules required dimness, but darkness was something else entirely, something dangerous for a man whose nights were crowded with memories sharp enough to wake him gasping. Naomi adjusted the lamp to its lower setting, just enough for the light to spill gently across the floor, not enough to intrude, just enough to remind him that the world beyond his door had not abandoned him. Then she moved through the living room with slow, rhythmic steps, humming beneath her breath. She did not sing, not really. She allowed only the faintest thread of melody to slip free, a sound without words, without demand. It was a tune her mother had once hummed during long nights at the diner where Naomi had grown up. A tune that asked nothing and promised nothing. A sound that seemed to make the walls exhale, as if remembering what comfort once felt like. When she passed the west room, she paused. Sometimes she rested her hand lightly against the doorframe, never crossing the boundary, never touching what lay beneath the cloth. She acknowledged the piano without disturbing it, wondering how long it had been since a single note had breathed through its strings, wondering how long it had been since Zion had allowed music to exist near him. On nights when the air felt heavy enough to fracture, Naomi cracked open one window near the staircase, no more than an inch or two. Moonlight slipped through the narrow opening and traced a pale path across the floor. She liked to think of it as an offering, a reminder that light still existed, whether or not he believed he deserved it. And sometimes she left a cup of tea outside his study door. Some nights, it remained untouched. Other nights, the cup shifted slightly, moved just enough that she wondered if she had imagined it. But she knew better. He saw it, he noticed. He understood that the gesture came from someone who expected nothing in return. It was on the fourth night that Naomi realized Zion was aware of her movements. She had just placed the tea beside the door when she heard the faint roll of his wheelchair approaching. Her breath caught, and she stepped back into the shadows near the corner of the hallway, expecting him to pass without hesitation. Instead, he stopped. The wheels went still inches from the porcelain cup. He said nothing. His hand hovered above the rim for a long moment before withdrawing. He did not drink the tea, but he noticed it. That was enough. That night, Naomi hummed a little louder as she moved down the hall, the sounds still soft enough to be mistaken for the house settling. She did not look toward his study. She did not wait for a response. Yet she felt something shift behind the closed door, as though the silence inside had tilted, ever so slightly. On the seventh night, Naomi tried something new. While dusting the high shelves in the library, she discovered a small silver music box tucked behind a row of untouched books. It was simple, worn smooth by time. When she opened it, the softest chime spilled into the room before she snapped it shut again, heart racing. Fear tightened her chest, not because the sound was loud, but because it felt fragile, like it could shatter something already cracked. She did not open it again, but that night, as she walked the halls, she let a hint of that melody guide her humming. Not quite a song. Not quite silence. Something suspended in between. Zion noticed. She felt it before she saw it, the subtle change in the air. The way the house seemed to listen. Near the west room, he emerged from the shadows, his presence solid and unmistakable. Naomi froze. He did not speak. He paused, as if assessing a disturbance he could not quite name. Then, without a word, he turned and moved back into the darkness. Naomi lowered her head, her pulse still racing. She did not know whether the sound had comforted him or unsettled him. She only knew that he had heard her, and that meant she existed in his world. The following morning, Marcus Reed arrived again, papers in hand, frustration etched into his features. Naomi greeted him briefly before retreating to her tasks. From the study, she heard his voice sharpen. "The board is asking questions," Marcus said. "They think you're slipping further. They want proof you can return to leadership, or they'll appoint someone else." "They can have the company," Zion replied distantly. Marcus's voice hardened. "And what about your life? What about the people around you?" Silence followed. Marcus exited the study and stopped unexpectedly in front of Naomi. His expression softened slightly. "Be careful with him," he said. "He can't afford hope, he can't sustain. Don't offer what you can't give." Naomi met his gaze calmly. "I'm not offering hope," she said. "I'm offering presence." Marcus studied her for a long moment, before exhaling. "He's forgotten what that feels like." Naomi understood. She had watched her father retreat into silence after losing his job at the mill. She had learned how to sit beside someone who could not ask for help. How to be steady enough to keep them anchored. That evening, Naomi encountered Zion in the hallway unexpectedly. He stood motionless by the window, staring through the heavy drapes at the faint outline of the lake beyond. She froze, uncertain whether to retreat. Without looking at her, he spoke quietly. "Why do you hum?" The question startled her with its softness. "It helps me feel less alone in big, quiet spaces," she answered honestly. "This house is meant to be quiet," he said, after a long pause. "I know," she replied. Then, hesitating, she added, "Silence can be heavy. It can crush people if they carry it alone." He turned just slightly, and in the dim light, she caught a glimpse of his face, not anger, but weariness, a fatigue that lived deep in the bones. After a moment, he wheeled himself away. Retreating from the conversation, like a man stepping back into armor, Naomi did not follow. That night, she performed her rituals again. The same small offerings, the same steady devotion that asked for nothing. She did not know if he listened, she did not know if he understood. But as she moved through the dim corridors humming softly, Naomi sensed something begin to shift inside the house. Not hope, not yet, but space. Space, where hope might one day learn how to breathe. The storm arrived without warning, rolling in over the lake with a force that bent the pines and made them groan like wounded giants. By late evening, the wind had become a living presence outside the Holt estate, howling against the stone walls, rattling shutters, demanding entry into a house that had long since shut the world out. Naomi Pierce moved through the rooms with a growing unease, checking each window twice, securing latches, tightening frames. Nothing she did could soften the pressure building in the air. It felt as though the storm was not only outside, but inside the house as well, pressing, waiting. Searching for something ready to fracture, she finished her rounds early, the hall lamps flickering under the strain of the wind. Beneath her feet, the generator hummed faintly, vibrating through the floors like a warning. Naomi knew storms unsettled most people, but she did not yet understand how deeply this kind of darkness carved into Zion Holt. She was standing in the kitchen, drying the last dish, when the lights died. The sharp click echoed through the room, and the house plunged into a void so complete it felt as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Naomi froze, the dish still in her hands. Outside, the wind slammed against the walls, relentless. Then a sound cut through the darkness. Not a crash, not a shout, a broken breath. Another followed, high, choked, Unrestrained, it did not sound like a man. It sounded like a soul drowning. Naomi dropped the dish gently into the rack and reached for the small flashlight she kept tucked into her apron pocket. Her hands trembled as she flicked it on, the narrow beam slicing through the suffocating dark. She moved quickly but quietly, her footsteps softened by thick runner rugs as she followed the sound toward the west hallway. There, cast against the far wall, she saw the trembling shadow of a wheelchair. Zion was gripping the wheels in a violent clutch, his body pitched forward. His breath came fast and staggering, echoing through the hall like someone trapped underwater. His head hung low, shoulders caved inward, as though the darkness itself were pressing down on him. Naomi stopped several steps away, instinctively careful not to startle him. "Zion," she said softly, her voice low and steady, as though waking someone from a nightmare. The reaction was immediate. His body jerked violently. In the beam of her flashlight, she saw his face contorted with panic, eyes wide and unseeing. He was not here. He was somewhere else, entirely somewhere filled with rain and glass and terror. "Imani," he gasped, the name cracking apart in his throat. "Imani, wake up, please, wake up." The words tore through Naomi's chest. She angled the flashlight downward so the light would not overwhelm him, and knelt slightly, lowering herself to soften her presence. "Zion," she said gently, "it's Naomi, you're safe. You're here." A violent tremor ran through him. His hands lifted, as if trying to push away memories only he could see. The darkness pulsed with every ragged breath he released. Naomi took a slow step closer. "I'm right here," she murmured. "You're not alone." For a moment, she feared he could not hear her. Then something shifted, a flicker of recognition deep beneath the terror. His gaze struggled toward her shape in the dim light. The wheelchair jerked forward slightly, an involuntary movement. Like reaching for the first solid thing in a collapsing world, Naomi raised the flashlight just enough to illuminate her face, keeping the beam soft and angled away. She did not touch him. She remembered the rules. She remembered the boundaries. Instead, she let her voice become the anchor. "You're here with me," she said slowly. "It's just the storm. Nothing else. Just the storm." His breathing remained ragged, but gradually painfully, slowly, the panic loosened its grip. His jaw unclenched. His fingers eased from the wheels by a fraction. Thunder rolled across the lake, deep and shaking. The house creaked, as though it might buckle beneath the combined weight of memory and weather. Lightning flashed, flooding the hallway with stark white light. In that instant, Naomi saw something she would never forget. Zion looked at her with raw, unguarded vulnerability. Not anger, not fear, recognition. The first recognition of another living soul standing before him in 2 years. Naomi held his gaze without flinching. "I'm here," she whispered. A low rumble followed, and the house shuddered again. Then, for the first time, Zion looked directly into her eyes. Not through her. Not past her. At her. The beam of the flashlight caught the faint glassiness in his eyes, the evidence of pain. So deep he had spent years refusing to let anyone see it. He swallowed hard, fighting for control. The lights flickered briefly, teasing a return, then failed again. Only her flashlight carved out a small world between them. Naomi steadied her breathing deliberately, slow and even, letting him match it. Outside, the storm wailed. Inside that narrow corridor of light, she created a universe where only calm existed. When his shoulders finally lowered from around his ears, Naomi exhaled quietly, relief warming her chest. She shifted the flashlight slightly, and its beam fell across the doorway of the west room. The cloth covering the piano rippled in the draft, the instrument's silhouette standing stark and alive, like a ghost of something once whole. Zion turned toward it instinctively. Anguish flashed across his face. In that moment, Naomi understood the truth with brutal clarity. His grief was not only for his wife, it was for the part of himself that had died with her, his music, his joy, his purpose. The storm had not only taken his ability to walk, it had stolen the sound from his soul. Naomi stepped just a fraction closer, careful not to cross the fragile boundary he still needed. "You're safe," she said again, her voice anchored. "You're not back there. You're here with me." Slowly, his breathing settled into something human again. The terror drained from his eyes, leaving only exhaustion carved deep into his bones. After several long moments, he nodded once, then shook his head slightly. An apology he could not find the words for. Naomi offered the smallest smile, one he might not have even seen in the dim light. "There's nothing to apologize for." He blinked. Startled by the gentleness of her tone, she waited, letting the silence settle between them not as a weapon, but as a blanket. When the power finally returned with a soft hum, warm golden light filled the hallway. Zion blinked as though waking from a long nightmare. Naomi switched off the flashlight. He looked at her, again longer, this time as if trying to understand why she had not run, why she had not recoiled, why she was still there. "Why did you come?" he asked quietly. "Because you were alone." He closed his eyes briefly, as if the simplicity of the answer hurt more than anything else. When he opened them again, the vulnerability had retreated behind a familiar wall, but something had changed. A crack had formed. Naomi felt it the way one senses a shift in temperature before dawn. She stepped back. Giving him space, he wheeled himself slowly toward his room, then paused just before turning the corner. He did not look at her, but he stopped, and that pause carried more intimacy than any words. When he disappeared into the West Wing, Naomi stood alone in the restored light, her heart steadying. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the house, something else had broken open, something long sealed, something aching to breathe again. She glanced toward the piano room, where the cloth still stirred faintly, as though the instrument itself had finally taken a breath after 2 years of silence. The morning after the storm felt fragile, as though the entire house were recovering from something deeper than a loss of power. Pale sunlight slipped across the hardwood floors, cautious and thin. And for the first time since Naomi Pierce had arrived, the Holt estate did not feel entirely submerged in shadow. The change was subtle, barely noticeable, unless one had spent nights listening to the sound of a man unraveling behind closed doors. Naomi moved through her routine with quiet focus, polishing the banister, refolding towels, tidying the dining room where no one ever sat to eat. Beneath her calm movements, something hummed inside her faint warmth that had not existed before. Like the afterglow of a candle, long after the flame was gone. Something significant had happened the night before. She could feel it in her chest, even if she could not yet name it, as she passed the west room. Naomi slowed, her fingers brushing lightly against the doorframe, as if checking whether the piano inside had truly stirred, even if only in spirit. She wondered whether Zion Holt remembered anything from the storm, or whether his mind had sealed the memory away behind the thick walls it had built for survival. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a message from the agency reminding her to avoid unnecessary interaction. The words felt distant, almost irrelevant now. She had already crossed a threshold, not through touch or conversation, but through presence. She had stepped into a space no one else had entered in years, and she knew instinctively that something inside Zion had registered it. Later, while organizing the pantry, Naomi's attention drifted to a stack of vinyl records tucked high on a shelf. A thin layer of dust coated them, evidence that they had not been touched since long before the accident. Standing on her toes, she reached carefully for one. The album was titled Lakeside Sonata. The cover showed a younger Zion, seated at a grand piano, his hands poised with effortless confidence. Beside him sat Imani, her cello resting against her shoulder, her smile radiant, intimate, alive. The joy in the photograph tightened Naomi's throat. She carried the record into the living room, where an old turntable sat unused, its surface dull with neglect. She hesitated. Sound was forbidden in this house. Music was a boundary no one crossed. Carefully, she set the record on the table without playing it, running her fingers lightly over the sleeve. What kind of man created music that still vibrated with life, years after it had fallen silent? That evening, Naomi sat alone in the staff kitchen. scrolling through articles about resonant labs and the work Zion had done before withdrawing from the world. Acoustic architecture. Immersive soundscapes. Programs designed to help veterans with PTSD by recreating calm through sound. He had not been only a musician. He had been a healer, a man who believed sound could ease suffering, and yet his own suffering had stolen sound from him entirely. Her chest ached with a heaviness she could not fully explain. When she found a recording he had composed for Amani 2 years before the accident, she set her phone aside and listened. The music began softly. Piano and cello intertwined like a conversation between two people who trusted each other without reservation. Halfway through, the melody swelled into something breathtaking, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with wind rushing past, held steady by the presence of the one beside you. By the final notes, tears slipped down Naomi's cheeks. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the tenderness woven into every chord. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of the love Zion had lost and the depth of the emptiness that had replaced it. She wiped her eyes quickly when she heard the faint roll of a wheelchair outside the kitchen. Startled, Naomi turned. Zion stood in the doorway. He had not entered the kitchen since she arrived. He studied her in silence, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, lowering her gaze. "I was just finishing up in here." His eyes moved to the counter, where the record sleeve lay forgotten. Something jagged crossed his face. "Why were you touching that?" His voice was low, sharp. "I found it while cleaning," Naomi said carefully. "I didn't play it. I wouldn't." He wheeled forward abruptly and grabbed the record, his hands trembling slightly as he held it. Pain swept across his features, raw and uncontrolled. And Naomi took an involuntary step back. "Do not go near her cello either," he said coldly. The word "her" echoed through the room like a wound reopening. "I wasn't trying to intrude," Naomi said quietly. "I just wanted to understand." "Understand what?" he snapped. "That this house is a mausoleum. That my life ended 2 years ago. That the only sound I can tolerate now is silence, because anything else rips me apart." His voice cracked on the last word. Naomi softened her posture. "I understand that you're grieving. But the music is part of who you were. It's part of who you are." "Do not tell me who I am," Zion shot back, the anger brittle, defensive. He turned sharply, dropping the record onto the counter with more force than intended. "Leave?" Naomi blinked. "Now," he repeated, though his voice wavered just enough to betray the truth beneath it. He was not angry at her. He was angry at the memories she had disturbed. She felt the sting of rejection, but steadied herself. "Every night I offer what I can," she said quietly. "If tonight you need anger, then take it." The words stopped him. His shoulders tensed, his breath catching. He did not look at her. He did not tell her to go. He simply sat there, knuckles pale around the rims of his wheels, a man held together by habit and fragile restraint. After several long seconds, he spoke again, softer. "Do not touch the cello." Naomi nodded. "I won't." He hesitated, then wheeled himself toward the west wing, his movements slower, less certain than usual. Naomi remained alone in the kitchen long after he left, her heart pounding. She had seen the pain in his eyes when he looked at the record, the tremor in his hands, the way his breath faltered when he spoke of music. It was not hatred. It was loss so deep, he could not bear to touch the things that had once made him whole. Later that night, Naomi passed the west room again. Through the slight gap in the doorway, she saw the cello case resting gently against the wall, and the piano sleeping beneath its cloth. She whispered into the quiet, as if the instruments themselves could hear her. "I won't push, but I won't walk away either." That night, she continued her rituals with even greater care. Her humming softened. The lights were adjusted more gently. The tea was placed with hands that understood the weight of simple offerings. Zion avoided her the next day, speaking only when necessary. But he did not ask her to leave. He did not rebuild the wall completely. He let the crack remain. And Naomi understood what that meant. A broken man is not held by force or by words. He is held by presence, by patience, by the quiet certainty that someone will stay. Even when the night presses hard against the heart, she offered him that certainty again and again, in ways that asked for nothing, yet meant everything. Morning light crept slowly across the Holt estate like a hesitant guest, slipping through the narrow seams where the heavy drapes failed to meet the edges of the windows. Naomi Pierce moved through the house with her usual quiet grace, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. Yet something inside her felt altered, as though the confrontation over the record and the storm before it had shifted the air in a way that could not be undone. She did not know whether Zion Holt would avoid her again or retreat deeper into the solitude that had become his armor. But she sensed that whatever distance he tried to rebuild would never fully erase what they had shared in the darkness. Some moments, once lived, refused to disappear. As Naomi passed the West Room, her gaze lingered on the piano beneath its cloth. She imagined it breathing beneath the cover, dormant but not dead. Music, she believed, never truly vanished. It waited, it mourned, it held its breath until someone dared to wake it again. Without fully realizing she had done it, Naomi lifted her hand and rested her palm lightly against the cloth. The fabric was cool beneath her skin, smooth and heavy. The gesture was not for herself, it was for him. A quiet promise she hoped the universe would remember. That morning, she tried something new. When she finished cleaning the West Room, she pulled the cloth back just a few inches, only enough for a single beam of sunlight to slip through and fall across the piano keys. Black and white gleamed softly, like teeth in the mouth of a sleeping creature. Naomi stepped back, studying the instrument as though it might stir at any moment. She whispered into the stillness, as if speaking to the room itself. "He'll play again. Not for me. Not for what's been lost, but for what's still here." Later that afternoon, Naomi was sorting books in the library when she heard the subtle sound of movement in the hallway. She turned instinctively. Zion passed the doorway, his wheelchair moving with its usual quiet precision. He did not look at her, but she saw the flicker of his eyes toward the West Room door, the smallest pause in his forward motion. Just a glance, then he continued on. Naomi felt a quiet bloom of triumph in her chest. Change, she knew, rarely announced itself. It arrived through hesitation, through moments so small they could be mistaken for nothing at all. That evening, she brewed chamomile tea and left it outside his study door. Hours later, when she passed the hallway again, she noticed the cup. It was empty, not moved, not ignored, empty. Naomi pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. Night settled over the estate once more, thick and deep. Naomi hummed softly as she moved through the rooms, letting the gentle vibrations sink into the walls. She did not know that Zion, sitting alone in his study, had begun to listen for that sound. Not deliberately, not consciously, more like a pulse. He had tuned himself to a reminder that something in the house was alive. Near midnight, Naomi passed the west hallway again and slowed, sensing something different. The air felt altered, charged with a presence that had not been there before. She stepped closer. The cloth covering the piano had been pushed back farther, her breath caught. The keys gleamed faintly in the dim light. The bench had been shifted slightly out of place. He had been there, maybe moments ago, maybe earlier in the evening, but Zion had come into the room and faced the instrument he had once loved more than anything except Imani. Naomi backed away slowly, careful not to leave any trace of herself behind. Whatever fragile curiosity had brought him there, she did not want to disturb it. She returned to the staff quarters, but sleep refused to come. The image of the uncovered keys stayed with her, vivid and aching. She imagined Zion sitting alone in the darkness, staring at the piano, his hands trembling with longing and fear. Around 2 a.m, Naomi rose again, drawn by an instinct she could not explain. She moved toward the west wing, her steps as quiet as falling snow. As she neared the doorway, she heard it, not music, not yet. The faint movement of wood, the soft creak of a bench, the sound of breath held too long. Naomi stopped just outside the room. Concealed by shadows as moonlight spilled across the floor, Zion sat at the piano. His back was rigid, shoulders tight, his fingers hovering above the keys without touching them. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a sea he had once known intimately, now afraid that stepping forward would pull him under. Naomi did not move. She did not announce herself. She let the moment belong to him. Slowly, Zion placed one hand on the keys. His fingertips brushed the cool ivory without pressing down. His breath quickened, his eyes squeezed shut. He pulled his hand back as though burned. He tried again. A tremor ran through his arm. His chest rose and fell unevenly. The grief was too close. The memory too sharp, the music too dangerous. Naomi lowered herself silently to the floor several feet behind him, making no sound that would force him to acknowledge her presence. Yet somehow he sensed her there. He did not turn, he did not speak, but the hard line of his shoulders softened, as if her nearness steadied the battlefield inside him. Time lost its meaning. Then it happened. His hand fell again to the keys. This time he pressed down. A single note rang through the room. Thin, fragile, unmistakably alive. Naomi clapped a hand over her mouth as tears stung her eyes. The sound hovered in the air like a heartbeat rediscovering itself. Zion froze, staring at the piano as though it had betrayed him, or perhaps, as though it had remembered him. His voice was barely a whisper, meant only for the darkness. "I thought I forgot how to feel this." Naomi did not move. She did not speak. She let him exist inside that trembling note. Slowly, he reached for another key. He pressed it, but the sound wavered, uneven, and broken. His hand shook visibly. With a frustrated gasp, he pulled away. His breath catching. Naomi rose quietly and sat on the staircase landing nearby, opening a book she had brought with her. She turned the pages softly, not to distract him, but to show him she was not watching. That he could fail without an audience, that his weakness was safe. He tried again. Another note, still trembling, still broken. Then his hands fell into his lap, exhausted. "Maybe someday," he whispered. Naomi closed her book but stayed seated, letting silence settle over the room like a gentle blanket. Zion turned his wheelchair away from the piano. At the doorway, he paused. He did not look at her directly, but his voice reached her, steadier than she expected. "You can turn on the hall lights now." It was not a command, it was permission. Naomi stood and flipped the switch. Warm light flooded the hallway, illuminating the piano behind him. Zion blinked, but did not recoil. For the first time since she had arrived, he allowed light to touch the place where his music slept. She watched him wheel away down the corridor, leaving something behind. Not music. Not yet, but a note. One trembling note suspended in the air between them, proof that the piano had begun to breathe again. Proof that Zeinholt had begun to breathe again. The morning that followed should have been gentle, almost tender after the fragile miracle of the night before. The house itself seemed to breathe more softly, as though aware that something sacred had occurred within its walls. But the world beyond the lake had no patience for fragile beginnings. And it arrived that morning with a cruelty neither Naomi Pierce nor Zion Holt had been prepared to face. Grey clouds hung low over the estate, dulling the light and pressing the air flat and heavy. Naomi was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when her phone buzzed sharply on the counter. She frowned, wiping her hands on a towel before picking it up. 3 missed calls from the agency. 2 messages from unknown numbers. 1 from a coworker she barely spoke to. Her pulse quickened. She opened the message first. "Naomi, look at this right now." A link followed. Her stomach dropped as she tapped it. Open. Her own face filled the screen in a grainy photograph. Zoomed and poorly framed, taken outside the Holt estate the previous afternoon, while she had been carrying groceries in from the service drive. Her head was down, unaware. The caption beneath the image read, "Brunette woman spotted entering reclusive billionaire Zion Holt's residence. Sources claim she is living there." Naomi scrolled, her hands beginning to shake. Another photo showed her walking toward the service entrance. Another headline followed beneath it. Is the fallen tech legend finally warming up to someone, or is this Maid taking advantage of him? Heat rushed to her face, sharp and humiliating. She kept scrolling, dread tightening her chest with every movement of her thumb. The comments were worse. They accused her of seduction, manipulation, gold digging, even abused. Zion not being elderly. This girl knows exactly what she's doing. One comment read, "Watch. She leaks something for money soon." Another added, "Naomi closed the browser abruptly, her breath shallow and unsteady. She had done nothing but work, nothing but offer quiet kindness to a man drowning in grief. And now strangers who knew nothing of that truth were painting her as a predator." Her phone buzzed. Again, "The agency, she answered with a trembling breath. "Hello, Naomi, what is going on?" her supervisor demanded. "We're getting inquiries from reporters. Someone leaked your schedule and your placement location. This is serious." "I don't know how this happened," Naomi whispered. "I haven't spoken to anyone." The supervisor exhaled sharply. "For now, stay professional. Stay quiet. We'll handle press inquiries, but this can't continue. We may need to remove you from the estate for safety reasons." Remove her. The word struck like a physical blow. Leaving this job was no longer just about employment. Leaving felt like abandoning someone who had only just begun to breathe again. "Please," Naomi said quietly. "Don't make any decisions yet. I won't talk to anyone. I'll stay out of sight. Just give me a chance to fix this. We'll discuss it later today," the supervisor replied coolly. "Until then, do not engage with any media." The call ended. Naomi pressed her palms against the counter, forcing herself to breathe. She had no idea how to fix something like this. She was a maid, not a public figure, not trained to fight narratives spun by strangers. But one thing was clear: she could not let this hurt Zion. She moved quickly through the house, closing curtains, tightening drapes, taking extra care at entry doors. She hoped he hadn't seen the news already, though she knew that hope was thin. The world moved fast, especially around a man who had once lived in its brightest spotlight. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard the faint clicking of a keyboard from the study. Her heart sank. He already knew. Naomi paused outside the open doorway. Zion sat at his desk, staring at the laptop screen. Blue light sharpened the lines of his face, his jaw rigid, his eyes cold and focused. He did not look at her, even though she knew he was aware of her presence. The silence stretched. "They're talking about you," he said finally, his voice low and flat. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Naomi replied quietly. His fingers tapped against the desk in a restless rhythm. "They think you're using me, I know." He looked at her then, and the weight of his gaze hit her like a sudden wind. "Do you understand what this means? They won't stop. They'll dig, they'll twist everything. My life has always been a target. Anyone near me becomes one too." "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steadying despite the tremor in her chest. "I didn't know anyone was watching. I didn't know they'd turn it into something ugly." He exhaled sharply. "The board already questions my stability. This will only confirm their doubts." Naomi stepped forward before she could stop herself. "I never wanted to cause trouble for you. I only wanted to help." Something flickered in his expression, almost, but it vanished just as quickly. Her eyes drifted to the laptop screen. The headline was still: "Open Maid seduces, disabled billionaire inside isolated mansion." The air left her lungs. "Didn't," she began. "I know you didn't." Zion cut in. She froze. But he continued, his voice quieter now. "What matters isn't the truth. It's what people believe. And what matters to me is that I can't handle another scandal. Not right now." The meaning beneath his words was unmistakable. Isolation had been his shield. Now that shield was cracking under the weight of strangers who knew nothing of his pain. "I'll stay out of sight," Naomi said quickly. "I won't go outside. I'll avoid the windows. I'll make sure there's nothing for them to photograph. I'll protect your privacy." Zion studied her for a long moment. Something in his eyes softened, just barely. "It shouldn't be your job to protect me," he murmured. "You were hired to clean, not to carry my ghosts." "You're not a ghost," Naomi said quietly. "You're a man who's been hurting for a long time. And I'm not leaving, unless you ask me to. Conflict flickered across his face. But he did not ask her to leave. Instead, he turned his chair away from her. Continue your tasks. Avoid the windows. Stay off your phone. She nodded and stepped back into the hallway. The pain of his silence cut deeper than the cruel comments online. She understood his fear. She understood his need to protect himself. But it hurt all the same as the day dragged on. The estate felt smaller, watched. Naomi heard cars along the access road. Voices. The click of a camera shutter. She closed blinds, drew curtains, hid herself from eyes that did not belong there. For the first time since arriving at the Holt estate, shame settled into her chest for something she had not done. By evening, Naomi sat on the floor of her small staff room, hugging her knees, unable to stop replaying the headlines. She wondered if she should resign before the agency forced her out. Then she remembered the single trembling note from the night before, the way Zion had looked at the piano with longing, instead of terror, the moment in the storm when he had anchored himself to her voice. She could not leave. Not now. Not when he had only just begun to find his way back. That night, Naomi did not hum. She did not leave tea. She did not walk the halls with her steady rituals. She stayed in her room, curled beneath her blanket, letting the quiet swallow her whole. Somewhere in the estate, she heard the faint roll of a wheelchair moving, back and forth, searching, pausing, searching again, and for the first time, the silence heard him to. Morning arrived with a weight Naomi Pierce felt before she ever opened her eyes. The air pressed down on her chest, thick and expectant, as though the silence had grown teeth overnight. She lay still for several moments, listening to the distant hush of the estate, bracing herself for another day inside a house that now felt smaller, more exposed, more fragile than it had before. She rose slowly, splashed cold water on her face, and studied her reflection until her breathing steadied. The paparazzi had retreated only because heavy snowfall had blocked the service road, but Naomi knew it was temporary. The knowledge that eyes could return at any moment followed her like a shadow. When she stepped into the hallway, she noticed something that made her pause. The drapes had been pulled open, just an inch. A narrow blade of grey morning light slipped through the gap, cutting across the floor like a question left unanswered. Naomi's chest tightened. She suspected Zion Holt had been awake for hours. She found him in the library mid-morning. He sat with his back to the door, his wheelchair angled slightly, as if he had rolled into the room without purpose, and then stopped. His hands rested slack in his lap. There was no laptop, no book, no shield between him and the emptiness he stared into. The curve of his spine looked defeated, folded inward by years of unspoken weight. Naomi hesitated, then cleared her throat softly. He flinched only slightly, but did not turn. "You weren't in the hall last night," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "I thought it would be better if I stayed away." "Better for whom?" The question caught her off guard. "For you," she said after a moment. "You were under enough pressure. I didn't want to add to it." Silence stretched between them. "That's what you think you are," Zion said, finally. "Pressure." She stepped closer, stopping a careful distance away. "That's what you looked like. You needed space, and I believed you." His fingers tightened faintly around the rim of his wheel. He exhaled slowly, the sound unsteady. "Come here." The request startled them both. Not an order, not a plea, just a need. Naomi approached and stopped beside him, still not touching. He kept his gaze forward. "Do you know why storms affect me the way they do?" he asked. She shook her head, even though he couldn't see it. No. Outside the tall windows, the lake lay restless, waves slapping the shore as though echoing his memory. "That night," he began, his voice low, "Imani had a late rehearsal. She was tired. She asked me to slow down. Or to stop somewhere." He swallowed hard. "I said no. I told her we needed to get home because I had an early meeting. I told her she was overreacting." Naomi's breath faltered, but she stayed silent. "The storm came faster than predicted," he continued. "Rain so heavy, it felt like the air turned to water. I should have stopped. I should have turned around. But I didn't. His fingers curled tighter. I always believed momentum could fix anything. His voice dropped. When the truck slid into our lane, I tried to correct. The car spun. We hit the guardrail. The impact threw her sideways. He paused, trembling. She wasn't wearing her shoulder belt. She'd unclipped it because it hurt her collarbone. She said she'd put it back on. I told her it didn't matter. Naomi closed her eyes. I remember the glass breaking, he whispered. I remember the sound cutting through everything. I remember reaching for her and realizing she wasn't breathing. His breath hitched violently. Screamed her name until my throat bled. Naomi pressed a hand against her own chest. When I woke up in the hospital, Zion said, his voice cracking. I couldn't feel my legs. But that wasn't the real loss. A tear slipped down his cheek. He wiped it away angrily. The real loss was that I was alive. And she wasn't. Naomi knelt slowly beside his chair. Careful, deliberate. You survived, she said softly. That isn't a crime. He let out a broken laugh. It felt like one. It still does. His eyes finally met hers. Do you know what the police report said? Weather conditions. Poor visibility. No one at fault. His jaw tightened. But they were wrong. I was at fault. I ignored her. I dismissed her fear. I always believed I knew best. Snow settled silently outside, as if listening. You can't punish yourself forever for one moment you wish you could undo. Naomi said gently. I do, he replied. Every day, every night, every storm, every time I see her cello, every time I look at this house she loved more than I ever did. The words fell like fresh snow, quiet, devastating. Naomi took a slow breath. You couldn't save her. But that doesn't mean you have to lose yourself too. Something inside him cracked, then not violently, but softly. A release. His eyes filled again. This time with relief as much as pain. I haven't cried in front of anyone since the funeral, he whispered. I was afraid if I started, I wouldn't stop. You stopped the night you kept living, Naomi said. Maybe not by choice, but you're still here. And you're allowed to feel all of this? She placed her hand flat on the floor, between them, not touching him, but close enough to anchor the moment. I'm here, she said. And I'm not leaving. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched. For the first time, he looked at her without bitterness or fear. I couldn't save her, he whispered. I know, Naomi replied, and then he cried, not quietly, not carefully, but fully, grief pouring out after years of restraint. Naomi stayed kneeling beside him, absorbing the storm of his sorrow without flinching, without trying to fix what could not be fixed. When the tears finally slowed, Zion leaned back, exhausted. The storm inside him had passed, leaving rawness in its wake. Naomi rose slowly and stepped back, giving him space. Before she left, she placed her hand flat on the floor again, letting him see it. A vow, a promise. I'm here, she whispered once more. He watched her go with awareness, with recognition, with something new forming quietly behind his eyes. For the first time since the accident, Zion Holt was no longer drowning alone. Night returned to the Holt estate, wrapped in a quiet so deep it felt almost deceptive, as if the world were holding its breath after the confession Zion Holt had released that morning. Fresh snow softened the grounds outside, covering the roads in white and muting every sound that dared to move. Inside the house, the stillness remained, but it was no longer hollow. Something fragile stirred beneath it. Something newly awake. Naomi Pierce felt the shift as she moved through the hallways, preparing the house for evening. She adjusted the low amber lights, moved with gentle footfalls, and paused near the west wing where the piano rested beneath its half-drawn cover. Since their conversation, she had not seen Zion, but she could sense him the way one senses pressure in the air before rain. He had opened a sealed part of himself, and such openings rarely closed without consequence. As she placed a fresh cup of tea outside his study, her hands trembled slightly. She had been his witness earlier, his anchor as he spoke the truth he had buried for years. Now she did not know what might follow. People who cracked open could retreat deeper, or they could reach out without knowing how. By the time Naomi finished her last tasks, the sky beyond the windows had turned pitch black. Winter darkness, swallowing even the moon. She hummed softly as she walked, cautiously resuming the habits she had abandoned after the scandal, keeping the sound low, enough that it barely existed. Then she heard something that made her stop cold. Not full music. The beginning of it. A single bow drawn slowly across a cello string. The sound was faint, slightly distorted, coming from a speaker somewhere deeper in the house. Naomi followed it carefully, her heart thudding, until she reached the west room. The door stood slightly ajar. Inside, Zion sat facing the cello case propped against the far wall. His laptop rested open on a nearby table, playing a recording of Amani performing alone. The melody began tenderly, then deepened into something mournful and exposed. Naomi froze at the threshold, afraid to enter, afraid to disturb a moment that looked too sharp to survive interruption. Zion's gaze remained fixed on the cello case, as if willing it to open on its own. His jaw clenched. His chest rose sharply with every breath. When the melody surged into a phrase thick with longing and heartbreak, he gasped. One hand flying to his chest, his breathing fractured. MIA-no. Naomi caught herself. Grounding her presence, he was seconds from unraveling again. She stepped into the room. Without thinking, Zion startled at the sound, panic flaring in his eyes. Don't, he whispered, choking on the air, as if her presence itself might push him past the edge. She stopped, but she did not retreat. The music swelled, filling the room with the last performance Imani had recorded before the accident. Naomi recognized it from the article she had read weeks earlier. He was punishing himself with memory, reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar. Zion tried to wheel backward, but his hand slipped. Panic surged. He grabbed the edge of the piano bench for balance, breath splintering into shallow gasps. Naomi crossed the distance in 3 steps and knelt beside him. Zion, she whispered. Stop, please breathe. He shook his head violently. I can't hear her without seeing Itharain, the glass, the blood. His fingers dug into the bench. He was spiraling here now, in front of her. His fear no longer hidden behind doors or darkness. Naomi reached out instinctively, then froze halfway. Remembering the rules, the boundary he still needed, she lowered her hand to the floor instead, letting him see it her presence without pressure. I'm here, she said quietly. You're not back there. You're here with me. Something trembled through him. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the bench harder as the music climbed toward a painful crescendo. I can't do this, he whispered. I keep failing her even now. Naomi leaned closer, her voice steady, though her heart raced. You're not failing her by remembering, she said softly. You're human. You loved her. Love doesn't end when someone dies, but neither should you. The cello line softened, the melody thinning into a fragile whisper. Zion lifted his head slightly, tears gathering in his eyes. His hand rose, trembling, reaching into the air as if searching for something he had lost long ago. And in that moment, instinct overrode every rule. Naomi extended her wrist into his line of reach, not touching him, but close enough to choose. Zion's fingers closed around her wrist. The contact was tentative, shaking, as if he were touching the present for the first time after being trapped in the past for too long. The music faded into its final lingering note, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the fragile tether between them. Mia, he whispered, then corrected himself almost immediately, grounding. Naomi, yes, she said, her breath catching. His grip tightened, slightly not desperate. Not possessive, just enough to anchor himself. Slowly, his breathing steadied. The tremors eased. He looked at her fully then, without defenses, without walls. I didn't mean to hold you, he murmured. But you needed something to hold on to, Naomi replied gently, and that's allowed. Emotion thickened his throat. I haven't touched another human being in 2 years. Her chest ached. Then let this be the first moment you choose not to be alone. When he finally released her wrist, the movement was slow and careful. Like surrendering a lifeline he wasn't ready to let go of. But he did let go. And in that release, something new appeared, small, fragile, unmistakable. Trust. Zion shut the laptop, cutting off the silence left behind by the music. Naomi rose and stepped back, giving him space. He watched her with an expression caught between gratitude and fear. "Don't leave," he said quietly. "Not tonight." Naomi nodded once. "I won't." She settled on the staircase landing nearby, not reading, not sleeping, just staying. Down the hall, Zion sat alone. The memory of her wrist lingering in his hand long after the night deepened. Morning arrived, pale and reluctant. Light sliding across snow-covered ground and into the house with careful fingers. Naomi awoke with the memory of his touch still warm beneath her skin. She knew the boundary between them had shifted and that such change required patience, not urgency. As she moved through the house, she heard an unfamiliar sound. A low thud. A strained breath. Silence. Her steps quickened toward the west room. Zion was no longer in his wheelchair. He gripped the piano bench with both hands, his body angled forward, arms trembling as he braced his weight. The wheelchair sat behind him, skewed, abandoned without caution. Naomi froze, fear and awe colliding in her chest. He hadn't stood in 2 years. She did not rush him. She did not touch him. She let the moment hold. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "Testing something," he managed between breaths. "Testing what?" "A feeling." He shifted, straining, breath-breaking. Naomi moved closer, hands hovering near him, ready but restrained. "I felt something," he whispered. "Last night." A spark. Her heart pounded. "Where?" He tapped weakly against his thigh. "Here." She crouched to meet his gaze. "Do you want to try standing?" Fear flickered across his face. "If I fall, promise you won't pretend it means nothing, I promise." He pressed down on the bench and lifted. His body shook violently. His legs resisted, then something flickered. A muscle responded. His heel shifted half an inch. Naomi gasped. He felt it. He lifted again. His torso rose another inch. His knees trembled. For one impossible, breathtaking moment, Zion Holt held his own weight. It lasted seconds, but it happened. He sagged back onto the bench, breath breaking into a sound that was half sob, half laughter. Naomi covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. "I felt it," he whispered. She nodded through her tears. "I know." They stayed there in silence, not celebrating, not promising miracles, just acknowledging what had begun. Hope had not returned loudly, but it had returned honestly, and this time, it had found something solid enough to stand on.